to the 9th late Professor Suresh Tendulkar Memorial Lecture, organized in the premises of Symbiosis School of Economics, Pune. Incepted in 2008, SSE is a bright, young, vigorous, and growing institution. Uh, it has intellectual discipline, critical and analytical assessment, which results in rational thinking, along with an understanding of the need for constraint optimization and a strong urge to strive towards achieving equilibrium. We at SSE achieve these goals in an educational environment committed to excellence and academic freedom. It offers graduate and undergraduate programs with the student strength above 800 with us at present and over 2,000 alumni. We are one of the proud leaders in undergraduate and postgraduate Department of Economics. The first late Professor Suresh Tendulkar Memorial Lecture was given in 2014, and since then the legacy continues. With this, I invite the respected dignitaries for lighting of the lamp ceremony and formal opening of the STML, 9th STML. May I please invite the dignitaries?
Asatoma Sadgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Sarvesham Swastir Bhavatu Sarvesham Shantir Bhavatu Sarvesham Purnam Bhavatu Sarvesham Mangalam Bhavatu Loka Samasta Sukhi.
With this, I now invite the Dean FOHSS and our Director Professor Chandiramani to give the opening remarks of the event and welcome the dignitaries.
At the outset, dignitaries on the dais, our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Rajni Gupte, the special guest for this morning, Dr. Sanjay Reddy, who's come from the New School for Social Research, New York, to deliver the lecture. My own professor from my master's day, Professor Seeta, Prabhu, who has come here today to grace this occasion. A very, very warm welcome on behalf of the students, faculty, staff of Symbiosis School of Economics to this 9th late Professor Suresh Tendulkar Memorial Lecture. Everybody would be asking the question, why have we instituted this lecture? And my first answer here is really, as you heard Dr. Niharika tell you, that we are nearly 15 years old. I remember in 2011, 2010, when I had just taken over as director, it was very important to start the master's program. So while we were busy defending it at the Board of Studies, I think many of you don't realize that getting a master's program going is a big deal. And I can see Dr. Rajni ma'am smile because she knows what Board of Studies happen, the amount of grilling that happens before you get a program approved. And the program got approved. I remember Ishita and my other colleagues on the 4th floor waiting when the first application for the master's program came in. And the excitement that was there. And then as soon as the master's program was going to take off, we knew we had the numbers and we were going to take off. I knew there was this great economist who was in Pune who would be the mentor for us. Yes, none other than Professor Tendulkar himself. But unfortunately, on the 21st of June, he passed away before our program commenced. And it was only in 2014, 3 years later, that I had the courage to go and meet his family and seek their permission to be able to institute this particular lecture. So I think you understand that it was really having Professor Tendulkar as our mentor. And I think he's here, though not physically, but in spirit and in his soul and his blessings, because every time we write to anybody and say, will you please deliver the Professor Tendulkar Memorial Lecture, I find nobody ever says no, because everybody is so happy to do that. And I think we've had stalwarts come over the years to come and deliver this particular lecture. Next year is going to be the 10th year, and we promised to come out with the 10 lectures that have come out of the series as a book, which would be there for SSE to keep. As a School of Economics, there is no doubt that we are having a vision for not only the school, but even for India. And what is that vision? We say from the Amrit Mahotsav to the Amrit Kal, 200 to 2047, India at 2047. And immediately the first SDG comes to your mind, the SDG of poverty. And, over the years, we know that poverty has become a multidimensional, problem. And when we talk about it as a multidimensional problem, there are multiple vulnerabilities that we look at. Health, COVID taught us the vulnerability that was there with health. We could see that. Education, COVID taught us even the digital divide in education that was there, and the multiple, how there is an inequity in that, and therefore there could be a poverty related to health, to education. Housing, when you talk about your slums, when you talk about the kacha homes, when you know how landslides wash away homes which are not even of strong, structures, a 10 by 10 home. I remember in one of our, when we had gone to one of our, surveys, and we asked a lady, how big is your house? And she said, da by da patra chahi, that means 100 square feet. 10 by 10 is what we talk about, and, it sensitizes everybody. The financial discrimination, the financial vulnerability, though we have the Jan Dhan Aadhar, yet there are lots of, if you've seen your Paytm, now it's in different languages, all to be more and more inclusive. And then the vulnerabilities go on beyond economic vulnerabilities, energy poverty. While we've been able to overcome that to a certain extent, I think it's a quality of energy. So poverty is in itself a multidimensional concept. And I think all you students have realized that we are looking at issues such as poverty, employment, education, health, infrastructure, and this forms a part of our research, localizing of sustainable development goals. And all of them are cross-cutting in their own way. And of course, the man-made development, whether it is Joshimath, whether it is Turkey, the earthquakes that have happened, whether we've recently come back from Itanagar and we've seen the kind of landslides that happen there, or what happens in Meghalaya. I mean, the east, you can see how when you're moving from Shillong to a place like, Cherrapunji, and you're driving down to that street, and you will see how the hills are absolutely shaved out there. Stones are being taken off, or you're trying to broaden the roads. And from green, you go gray. And then that's the climate change, the disaster that we are looking at. So poverty truly is multidimensional. And there's so many ways that you can link with it. And so now you realize why we established the Professor Tendulkar Memorial Lecture based on this model. Talking about Professor Tendulkar, born in Kolhapur, studied in Pune, Peru Gate Bhave School, Pune, BMCC College, just half a kilometer down this road, a master's in economics and statistics from Delhi School of Economics, completed his PhD from Harvard, came back to ISI. Look at all the institutions that he belongs to. So tall. And then he's been a member of so many committees, whether it is on the expert group on estimation of proportion and numbers of poor, the Central Finance Pay Commission, the 5th Central Pay Commission, the first Disinvestment Commission. We talk about disinvestments, of course, which is a far dream even till date. Then the National Statistic Commission, and he's written a couple of books, research papers, been on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, has given his estimations of poverty numbers and the measurement of poverty. And for all that, we will have Professor Sanjay speak about that today. But I have a little note from the family. And what is this note from the family that they have shared with me? Let me read. I'm just trying to find that. They have, in fact, expressed their inability to attend today because Dr. Tendulkar's wife is unwell, and she felt she's been coming every year, either in the online or in the offline format, but she felt she was unsteady on her feet and had the viral that many of you are, many of us have it from time to time, and the viral has really mutated and become bad. So she's wished Professor Sanjay Reddy all the best. She said that you and her late husband have done their PhD from the same university. Her daughter expressed her best wishes for you to deliver this lecture, and she also said that she's sorry because her daughter is sitting for the 10th exam and therefore they're not here. On this very personal note, I think we'd be, without coming in the way of further having to hear Professor Reddy, we move on with the proceedings of the program, and happy that we are here today, all of you students, so happy to see it absolutely packed for the 9th Professor Tendulkar Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful, insightful opening remarks. We definitely sensitized more towards SDGs, and we now know how and why was the STML conceptualized. With this, I now take the opportunity to introduce our chief guest of the day, Professor Reddy. Dr. Sanjay Reddy is an associate professor and chair of economics at the New School for Social Research, New York. He is an affiliated faculty member of the Politics Department of the New School for Social Research. Sir teaches development economics, microeconomics, philosophy and economics, and other subjects. Sir has widely published in academic journals in economics and related subjects and given many prominent academic lectures. He was elected a fellow of the Human Development and Capabilities Association. He has been a member of editorial advisory boards of various international journals, various reputed international journals like American Review of Political Economy, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa and Middle Asia, Global Justice Theory, Practice, Rhetoric, Humanity, the Journal of Globalization and Development, the Review of Agrarian Studies, and the Review of Income and Wealth. Sir was also the associate editor of the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities. He was a lead author of the International Panel on Social Progress. Sir has held fellowships from the Center of Ethics and Center for Population and Development Studies at Harvard University, the Center for Human Values at Princeton University, the Justitia Amplificator Program of the Goethe University of Frankfurt and Free University of Berlin, and the Advanced Research Collaborative of the City University of New York. Sir has received research grants from various sources. Sir was a member of independent high-level team of advisors to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations on the long-term positioning of UN development system. He has also served as a speaker and moderator on various high-level panels of the Economic and Social Council and other UN bodies. Sir has been a member of the advisory panel of the UN Development Program's Human Development Report, the UN Statistics Division Steering Committee on Poverty Statistics, the advisory board of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, and in other advisory functions for international and non-government organizations. Sir is a co-founder and team leader of the Global Consumption and Income Project. Sir has been quoted, his work has been cited, and his opinion articles have been published by news media, including Barron's, the Boston Globe, the Boston Review, The Economist, Foreign Policy, The Financial Times, The Guardian, The Hindu, Nation, National Post, The New York Review of Books, and Project Syndicate. Sir's work has been translated into multiple languages, and we should know that Sir holds a PhD from Harvard University in 2000. With this, I request VC ma'am to please felicitate Sir. The chair of our session today is Dr. K. Seeta Prabhu. Ma'am doesn't need any introduction. I would quickly introduce ma'am. Professor K. Seeta Prabhu is the leading exponent of the human development approach and sustainable development goals. Ma'am is currently visiting professor and senior advisor SDGs at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Professor Prabhu is a member of the editorial team for Journal of Human Development, a member of governing board of the Giri Institute of Development Studies, Lucknow, and an advisor of Habitat Forum INHAF. Ma'am was Tata Chair Professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai till August 18, and Program Director of the Prime Minister's Rural Development Fellows Scheme of the Ministry of Rural Development, Government of India till 2017. Ma'am was with the United Nations Development Program, India, current country office till 2013. With this, I would now request VC Ma'am to please felicitate Professor Prabhu. Thank you so much, ma'am. With this, I now request the Vice Chancellor of SIU, Professor Rajni Gupte, to please give her remarks for the event.
Thank you, and good morning. Very good morning to everyone. Our esteemed chief guests this morning for the Suresh Tendulkar Memorial Lecture, Dr. Sanjay Reddy, the Associate Professor and Chair Economics at the New School of Social Research at New York. The chair for this session, Professor Seeta Prabhu. She is a retired professor from Mumbai University and a visiting professor at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Dr. Jyoti Chandiramani, Dr. Sudeepa, faculty members, staff, and my dear students. It's always a pleasure to be at the Symbiosis School of Economics, and I think you all know the reason why, that I come from the domain of economics. Though it's ages and ages since I have been doing any economics now. All I do is just academic administration, which I can tell you is quite numbing. But that said, I think I'm delighted to be here this morning. And it's a great pleasure to have someone, a tall leader like Dr. Sanjay Reddy, over here to address us this morning. And Dr. Seeta Prabhu, thank you so much for gracing the occasion. And we do indeed look forward to listening to you. But let me share a little bit about the university for our esteemed guests over here. Symbiosis International University, as I was telling you a while earlier, is a multidisciplinary university which is currently located largely in Pune. Most of our institutes are in Pune, but we also have a presence in Noida, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Nagpur, and Nasik. So that's the spread of the university now. And these are we call them the off-campus centers. The university offers programs at the undergraduate, postgraduate, and at the doctoral level. And these are offered in 8 major disciplines. This is management, law, humanities, of course, engineering, health sciences, media, communication, architecture, and design. So that's a wide spectrum of programs that we have at the university. As I was mentioning to you, the focus of the university now is to create more and more interdisciplinary programs and research. We have about 20,000 students in all. These are the full-time students at the university, which is across all these institutes put together. And we have around 90 programs that we offer at the university level. So that's just to give you a broad picture of the university. And very many of our students themselves don't really know what lies beyond their own school. So I thought I'd give you this little pen picture of what the university is all about. As a university, we are ranked quite high in the National Institutional Ranking Framework. We are at number 32 out of nearly more than 1,000 universities in the country. And I think that's largely because most of our institutes are ranked among the top 10. So while we do believe that academics is important, I think at Symbiosis it goes way beyond academics. As a university, we believe that our students need to have a well-rounded education. And right from the beginning, for all our programs, we've made sure that the role of collaboration with industry is very, very strong. So, of course, we started with the management programs. And in management, you will agree with me that it is actually the practitioners who need to be teaching those programs. And that's how the idea of visiting professors was born in Symbiosis. So, way before the university was born only in 2002. But our management programs existed from 1978. And this was possible because in Pune, we have a large number of industries, and people from the industry were very happy to come in and share their experiences with our students. And this excellent practice, I mean, they did not need to be PhDs, they did not need to have any publications, much different from what it is today. But their excellent inputs made sure that our students went out industry ready, they made a mark for themselves, and that's really how our management schools grew. And they made a name for themselves. So even before they joined the university, each of our management schools had a very, very strong presence in the market. We, of course, continued this good practice of associating with the industry when we became a university. So we made sure that if it is a law school, they had judges on campus, they had people who came in and gave practical experience to the students. Similarly, in every domain, we made sure that there is an excellent connect with the industry. So whether it's think tanks, whether it's people from the industry, whether it's lawyers, doctors, each domain had people who contributed to making the curriculum. So they are part of the academic council, they are part of the board of studies. So they help in the design of the curriculum. Also, they help in the delivery of the curriculum because very many of them are associated with us as adjunct faculty or as visiting faculty. So while academics is one of our strong points and the connect with the industry is strong, I think one more factor that I would like to mention here is our strong connect with the community around us. And I do believe that this is something that we feel every student of Symbiosis must go away with. The sensitivity to the people around us. Very often we get students from fairly affluent families, and it's important for us to sensitize them to the less fortunate amongst us. And at the university, I was just telling you that it's about 15 kilometers from here, but a very short distance away from the university, there are about 22 villages. And these, if you go to these villages, you realize that they do not even have the basic amenities. So it feels so strange that you have a city here which is so well developed, and just in the vicinity, 15, 20 kilometers away, you have these villages which are access compromised, where health is a problem, where education is a problem. So we sort of adopted these villages and we made sure that our students visit them. We have a mobile medical van which goes to all these villages all through the week. It travels across all those villages, providing basic health care to them. And of course, now that we have a hospital on the university campus, it's much easier for us to deal with all of them. But the way students connect with this is very important as far as we are concerned. So the health and nutrition students would go there and educate the young mothers over there on nutrition matters, or the students from the School of Telecom Management or Banking and Finance, educate them on financial literacy, teach them about the government schemes. We now have a digital literacy van, which is actually just a van which has got converted with computers in it. It roams the villages and you should see the people thronging that van. It's overfull, it's overbooked. They all want to learn how to use computers. They want to learn how to make use of the new technology that can possibly transform their worlds. So this is what I thought I would share with you about the university, about how we believe our students should be shaped. I think every lecture like this reminds me more and more of the way we feel that classroom learning is not just the way students will learn. It is also beyond the classroom. It is events like this where you have stalwarts coming and talking to you, giving you an opportunity to listen to different points of view, to deliberate, to discuss, and to have an open discussion on topics that interest all of you. So, Dr. Reddy, once again, let me thank you so much. Today's topic is extremely interesting. I think the challenge of growth and development with inclusive growth is really something that is a challenge and has been talked about for many, many years. It's only getting more and more acute as the inequalities rise and as we realize that there is a distinct gap between the haves and the have-nots. I was just describing to you that just 20 kilometers away from Pune, we already can see this divide so very starkly. And I think this could lead to social problems if not addressed in time. And I think young people like you do have a big role to play in making sure that this process of sensitization should awaken in you a sense of wanting to do something to bridge this kind of a gap. But I'm sure we are all eager to listen to Dr. Reddy and Dr. Prabhu. So thank you once again for having me here this morning. And I, of course, look forward to listening to both of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, VC ma'am. Ma'am has always been very supportive of all the activities that we conduct at SSE. Thank you, ma'am, for reminding all the great works that university does and reminding us how proud we are to be part of SIU. Thank you so much. Go ahead with the proceedings of the event. I now request Professor Seeta Prabhu ma'am to please give her opening remarks.
Thank you very much to all the dignitaries on the dais, Dr. Rajni Gupte, Professor Sanjay Reddy, Dr. Jyoti Chandramani, and Sudeepa Majumdar, and all the faculty and students here. I find it always rewarding to come and visit the Symbiosis Institute because of the enthusiasm that is there and the wide range of subjects on which discussion is organized. So when Professor Chandramani asked me to come and chair this session, I was more than happy because it also gives me yet another opportunity to pay my homage to Professor Suresh Tendulkar, who has been the doyen among economists and contributed phenomenally to the area of poverty. It's not just the measurement, though he's better known for the measurement issues, but also of the ways in which poverty can be looked at and what can be relieved to. And he was very active in the policy circles also. So I find this an extremely good opportunity. Now, I'm equally, sort of happy to know that Professor Sanjay Reddy is here to deliver the lecture. Professor Reddy has already been introduced, but I would like to add just a couple of sentences that there are very few people. Normally, poverty and inequality are looked at, in different silos. And you also find that the poverty studies do not normally bring in ethical values. He has had a background in ethics and philosophy, and that is something that, can't hear? Yeah, I think that. He has background. Yeah. He has, sort of engaged in ethical considerations as well as in the way in which poverty can be looked at from the point of view of values and norms. So what I would like to say briefly is that at this current juncture, when you have a polycrisis, multiple crises, whether it is the COVID-19, whether it is the employment conditions deteriorating and unemployment rising, low economic growth, social unrest, climate change of all things, they've all come together. And the term that is now being used is polycrisis. When you say polycrisis, there are numerous crises that are playing out at the same time and interacting with each other. So as a result, you will find that the impact of the polycrisis is much larger than the sum total of each one of the crises. So, and secondly, I would also like to point out, to set the context, that we are now in the age of the Anthropocene, where individual actions, human action, will influence the outcomes on nature. Earlier, it was natural phenomena that used to determine certain things. Now, increasingly, we have entered this era by our own policies, follies, and extreme degradation of our ecological resources. So at this time, people are very vulnerable. And with COVID-19, you already found that 120 to 150 million people, according to the World Bank, have been pushed back into poverty. At a time when we thought that there is some success on the SDG Goal 1, that poverty is finally coming to be controlled, and we, in a near future, go to a very, very minimal level, you find that the poverty has surged, and there are large number of people who have been pushed back into poverty. while the recovery has been there, it has been slow and halting, and employment opportunities have become extremely fragile. So vulnerability, what Professor Jyoti has also mentioned, is also increasing. And given this scenario, it is only appropriate to take a look at what the issues concerning poverty are, and inclusion certainly. Because Professor Reddy is one person who straddles both the human development field as well as the poverty studies. So I'm particularly pleased that he is here today. And maybe I'll reserve my other comments after he delivers the lecture. I do not want to stand between him and the students. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving us a wonderful preview of how the lecture would look and what do we expect from this topic. With this, I now invite Dr. Reddy to please deliver the 9th Professor Tendulkar Memorial Lecture.
So good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here. I must say I'm quite overwhelmed by the warm welcome and by the presence of the distinguished Vice Chancellor, Dr. Gupte, who I'm also very pleased to learn is a member of the fraternity, fellow economist, not to mention the leadership of the School of Economics, about which I've learned a great deal this morning, namely Professor Chandi Ramani and Professor Majumdar. And of course, my friend, and I would also call her mentor, Professor Seeta Prabhu, who has been a wonderful example of what it means to be devoted to the cause of, let us say, human development, the broadest possible vision of what the development process ought to stand for, and who it should reach and in what ways, which is also going to be the theme of my comments this morning. I had the great honor and pleasure to know Professor Suresh Tendulkar a little bit, and from that point of view and others, I'm extremely honored to be able to deliver the 9th Suresh Tendulkar Memorial Lecture. Of course, he was also a really splendid example of treating economics as a subject which ought to be concerned with human beings and the outcomes that they actually experience, not a subject that's only concerned with the production of wealth or stock market indices or such matters, important as they may be, but also with the question of how people actually experience their lives. To use the phrase that Amartya Sen has used in some of his recent work, how people's lives go. The title of my talk today is Elusive Inclusive Development, and I'm going to just touch on a few themes related to this because I'd like to stay within the schedule. We have only about 30 to 35 minutes for me to speak. The way I'd like to open the discussion is by noting that the concept of inclusive development has appeared in various guises over many decades. And perhaps it's not surprising that it should do so, because what it attempts to capture are, in some sense, the central questions that ought to concern us if we are concerned with how people's lives actually go. Namely, in what ways does the development process reach or affect and hopefully benefit ordinary people, including, of course, the poor or the poor and the poorest, but also encompassing what we might call the vast majority of the population. I borrow that phrase from my colleague Anwar Sheikh. Now, we can find many, many examples, but I'll just point to a few here. The Bombay Plan, which some of you may be familiar with, before independence, had as its objectives, among others, to raise the standard of living of the masses of the population and to achieve certain minimum living standards. So there was from the beginning an idea that India's development, and of course this was also very much present in the various 5-year plans after independence, ought to be concerned ultimately, whether or not proximately, with goals that could be linked to how people's lives actually go. Naturally, there were some tensions involved between the present and the future. For instance, more saving today might mean depriving people immediately, but providing for them and for their children in the future. Another example, now from the global setting and some decades later, was the concept of growth with redistribution, which was coined by Hollis Chenery and Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Before he joined the government of India, he worked in the World Bank as a young economist. And Hollis Chenery, as you would have noted, was the thesis advisor of Professor Suresh Tendulkar. So perhaps it's not inappropriate that I should mention this concept here today. The idea of growth with redistribution was brought forward in the World Bank during the presidency of Robert S. McNamara, who was the first World Bank president to put poverty at the center of the World Bank's program, poverty reduction, as opposed to the enhancing of growth of countries. And it reflected the recognition that the growth process around the world was not necessarily delivering for people, in particular in the form of poverty reduction, but also that it was being accompanied in some instances by stark or apparently stark increases in inequality. Brazil, for example, was a case of a country which was recognized to have experienced quite rapid growth, but also to have experienced an apparent sharp rise in interpersonal inequality. And of course, this was the period when the first household surveys were emerging, which allowed economists to begin to quantify what these inequalities actually were. So the notion of growth with redistribution was of arriving at policies, principles, approaches which would enable the growth process to avoid such outcomes and instead to be, we might say, more inclusive. The concept of human development, with which Professor Prabhu and, in my smaller way, myself have been associated. And of course, many others, Professor Amartya Sen, my teacher, and of course, Dr. Mahbub al-Haq and many others, has the same element or aspect of being concerned with how people's lives go. And for that reason, perhaps taking a somewhat more radical approach of focusing a little bit less on growth, certainly not viewing growth as an end, but viewing growth only as a means to that end. More recently, in the current millennium, in China, we've seen the concept of a harmonious society propounded by the Chinese Communist Party, partly as a way to respond to concerns about rising inequality. And I will show you some data or a picture about that. So within the national context as well, we see some envisioning of what a development process which is more inclusive might look like. And of course, the government of India has, at various points, referred to the concept of inclusive growth or inclusive growth and development. Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas is also such a concept, and I will elaborate on that momentarily. It has, interestingly, a reference to process as well as outcome, which I think is also present in a number of these ideas. So what does inclusivity actually mean? Now, I think that inclusive development is a good example of what we might call a complex concept. It brings in under its heading or under its umbrella many different ideas which are intertwined and not wholly disentangleable. And again, that's not a surprise because it is a way in which, because it is as a concept meant to capture our fundamental concerns that the process of development should be one that reaches all and benefits all. So at one end, we have what we might call absolute or absolutist, perhaps, conceptions of inclusive development. For example, those who have focused on inclusive growth, which is a very more particular idea of development, of inclusive development. Within this particular absolutist tendency, have by and large been concerned with poverty reduction, whether or not the growth process has led to poverty reduction. They have also been concerned with whether or not there have been gains of some kind for all. The absolute or absolutist approach is not especially concerned with measuring the relative proportionality of those gains for different people. It's only concerned with whether or not gains are experienced. In contrast, we can also, I think, identify some more relative, I won't call them relativist, which has a slightly different connotation, but more relative conceptions of what inclusivity might mean, in which the question concerns not only whether there are gains for all, but what is their relative proportionality. So one view, for instance, might be that unless there are at least equal proportional gains for all, then the growth process has not been adequately inclusive. One might even go further and suggest that the larger are the proportional gains for people who are less well off, the more inclusive the growth process is. And one might go even further than that, calling for as large as possible absolute gains for people who are less well off, which is more demanding because people who are less well off start from a lower base. So the same proportional gains translate into smaller absolute gains. These and other ideas have been among those which have been discussed in the literature on inclusive growth in particular. But as I noted, we can take a more expansive conception which concerns with how people's lives go, especially the less well off, the poor, the majority, or the vast majority. And if we were to take that broader approach, then we would be concerned not only with income gains and their distribution, but we would also be concerned with such things as the non-income dimensions of life and what improvements are experienced in that regard, to what extent deprivations are reduced, in what ways public amenities of various kinds and public goods are available to people. We can think about green space or clean air, for example, among many other instances, and so on. And then finally, we might be concerned with inclusivity is also involving a participatory or a democratic element, or at the very least a consultative one, in which people are involved in some way in making the choices that affect them. And I think this notion is at least implicit in the concept of sabka saath. Okay. Now, what about growth and distribution generally as processes? How should we think about them? Well, mainstream economists have by and large treated them as separable. Certainly that's been the dominant tendency in technical economics of the second half of the 20th century and the early 21st century, in which the focus has been on, so to speak, maximizing the size of the pie, or the cake if you prefer, and subsequently in distributing it. This is the typical conceit, as the economists here will know, in international trade theory, for example, and in many other domains of public policy analysis. That what we ought to do in the first instance is to eliminate as much as possible the distortions or the impediments to making the pie or the cake or whatever you like as large as possible. And then thereafter we can apply appropriate redistributive tools in order to ensure that the people who we would like to receive a certain share of that enlarged cake do get it. But of course, there are a number of premises which are involved, which are questionable. For example, that the ex post of production redistributive process is costless, which it may not be. It may be quite difficult from the point of view of actually capturing those resources to be redistributed and redistributing them without loss to the people who ought to receive it, and indeed even to identifying who those people ought to be. So from a variety of points of view, the project of redistribution after production may actually be quite vexed, may be quite difficult and challenging. And that is perhaps one of the reasons that we don't see as much redistribution as we might think would be optimal, or economists might think would be optimal from a social welfare point of view. I'm leaving aside, of course, all the political economy reasons why that might not be the case, which are also quite serious. In this tradition in economics, there's typically assumed an idealized social welfare maximizing government, right? And some of us may be excused, I think, for raising an eyebrow at the notion that that is the nature of the government. But even if we assume that the government is of that kind, to the extent that it faces these various impediments, it would no longer be possible to achieve the so to speak, optimal level of redistribution. Right? So this seems to me to be a not very well-founded way of thinking about the relationship between growth and distribution. And I would suggest we ought to instead think about the relationship in a very different way, as if there is a single process which is by and large giving rise to both. That the growth process as we actually experience it involves changes in income, for example, that are experienced by the different people in society to different degrees, and that reflects the nature of that growth process, whatever it may be, which may include, for example, spatial components. Within India, for instance, as I will show you, certain states have experienced growth to a larger extent than others. It may include social components. It may be that particular groups, social groups, caste groups, for example, or classes are more likely to benefit, have benefited from the growth process. It may be that people who have particular kinds of skills or who are well positioned already, perhaps who have assets, financial or otherwise, that they can deploy in order to make investments, are better positioned to benefit from the growth process, and so on. And in that way, the growth process would also give rise to certain distributional outcomes as part and parcel of what that growth process is. Right? I don't want to go on a long theoretical excursion, but suffice it to say that there is a tradition in economics, certainly in macroeconomics, where distributional concerns are seen as contributing to growth, for example, because they affect the aggregate level of savings. But here I'm referring, I think, to a rather basic thought, which doesn't require us to go into all of those very specific ideas, which is simply that we should think about these two processes as being, to a considerable extent, fundamentally intertwined. Okay. Now, let me show you here, just to give you a little bit of a background, a portrait of what has happened in the world between 1990 and 2010. I apologize that some of the final years in what I'm going to show you here and later are a little bit dated. It's not entirely straightforward to keep all of this up to date. And in particular, I don't know if there's a pointer here. Is there? I'm not sure if there is. Is there a pointer? I don't think it's not quite showing. Doesn't matter. It's not important. So let me just say that this is a picture of the world distribution of consumption. The world distribution of income is very similar. The difference, of course, is that income also includes savings, but this is perhaps arguably more closely connected to people's welfare. And many of the poverty assessments that are done in terms of consumption rather than income. And you can see here, perhaps you can't see it very easily from where you are, but you can see here a picture of how the world distribution, the distribution for India and the distribution for China have respectively changed between 1990 and 2010. And the world distribution is the blue dashed and light blue solid distribution. The distribution for India is the dashed red and solid red or pink distribution, and that for China is the dashed green and solid green. And what you will see also marked there is that China had the biggest increase in median income in this period, 281%. India had only a 36% increase, and the rest of the world had only a 12% increase. So not surprisingly, in this period, China drove the poverty reduction, measured poverty reduction at any rate, that was experienced globally. In some of my other work, I've been quite critical of the World Bank's global poverty estimates, but taking those and approaches of that kind for now as those to be employed, which draw on consumption data of this nature, it's quite clear that with the sizable shift in the distribution that China experienced, there would be sizable poverty reduction in China, and indeed there has been, and not only has there been, but because of China's massive contribution to the world population, and in particular to the poor in the world population in the starting year, 1990, the big decrease, that took place in Chinese poverty really is what moved the overall decrease in global poverty. I won't get into the specificities of poverty lines and so on, because as I mentioned to you, I'm a little bit skeptical of them when one gets into those particularities. But I think you can see from these distributions that whatever poverty lines one employed within a certain range, the Chinese contribution to poverty reduction would be very sizable. Certainly in this period was very sizable as compared to India's and as compared to other regions of the world which also have poor people. And of course, going beyond poverty would have made a large difference to the living standards of Chinese people. At the same time, the picture of what happened within these same countries in terms of relative inequality is quite striking, and perhaps I should say strikingly different, though it's of course not incompatible, but it leads to a different view, let us say, of how inclusive the process of growth was. The line, the circle, the large circle toward the top left of this diagram refers to China. The sizes of the circles reflect the populations. And the red solid circle is India. On the horizontal axis, you have the income Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality in 1980. And in the vertical axis, the income Gini coefficient in 2013. So you can see that any country that's on the 45-degree line is one whose inequality, measured relative inequality, as calculated by the Gini coefficient, has not changed. And India is almost exactly on that line. So in terms of measured income inequality, India's inequality hardly increased. Now, one may have reasons to be skeptical about the quality of the Indian data in this respect, especially because of its possible failures to capture top-end incomes, which would, of course, be not a problem that's unique to India. It's something that is an issue across the world. And I will get back to that later. But what's very clear is that China experienced an enormous increase in inequality in this period of time. So China simultaneously had very steep decrease in poverty and a very sharp increase in relative inequalities. And this immediately raises for us the question, was China's growth process inclusive or not? Well, obviously it would depend in part on whether one adopts a more absolutist conception or a more relative conception of what inclusivity is. Now, for India, we can look more specifically, if we want to understand the growth process a little bit more carefully, at what are called growth incidence curves, which tell us what different quantiles or fractiles of the population, when they are ranked in terms of income, experienced by way of growth over a given period of time. These particular diagrams come from a paper which was done by student from my department, Rishab Kumar, who is now at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and Prakash Lungani from the IMF, and another co-author. And you can see from these growth incidence curves that to some degree, the better off, that's the right-hand side of these curves, experienced higher growth rates in the 3 periods that are shown here, okay, which cover 1983 to 2011, 1993 to 2011, and 2004 to 2011. So they're different overlapping periods, with the longest period being that at the top left. But by and large, these are more or less flat lines, right, with some uptick, as economists seem to like to say, on the right-hand side. And this is the reason that India's measured Gini coefficient scarcely increased in the earlier diagram that I showed you. Right? So there's some measured improvement in people's lives, economic growth having taken place across the board, with the best off having experienced somewhat greater increase, but not markedly greater. Okay. Meanwhile, and here I'm trying to, of course, present something of an analogy to what has happened in China. Although there is a great debate on income poverty, or consumption poverty, if you like, in India, and to what extent it has actually decreased, in which I will not enter, except to say that my view is somewhere in between the extreme views of Utsa Patnaik and Surjit Balla, right? One of whom believes that poverty has actually increased, as far as I can understand her view, and another of whom believes that poverty has decreased to such an extent that it is non-existent in India today. So I do not share either of those views, but I'm not going to go into the details of my own view at this time. I prefer to use, at least as a starting point, though, what Albert Hirschman referred to as the interocular test, the great development economist Albert Hirschman, which he meant as a slightly joking reference to the terminology that statisticians use. The interocular test is looking at something with your own eyes. So if you look at something with your own eyes and you see something in front of you, that's also relevant information, right? Whatever the econometrics say. So from the standpoint of the interocular test, I'm not entirely persuaded by either of the two polar positions that I mentioned. But putting income poverty aside, if we look at multidimensional poverty, and this is from the UNDP, India Office's report on multidimensional poverty from 2018, I believe, you will see that across the board there are improvements in terms of the different non-income aspects of well-being, decreases in non-income deprivations as measured here by years of schooling, school attendance, child mortality, nutrition, electricity, sanitation, water, housing, cooking fuel, and possession of assets, right? So again, it looks as if you have something to say in this regard about the inclusivity of the development process, here multidimensionally viewed, right? But on the other hand, well, maybe it's not so obvious that the process has been inclusive in every way. This is Forbes magazine's estimate of the number of Indian billionaires in the world's top 100 at this moment in time, updated continuously. And in that are Mukesh Ambani, Gautam Adani, Shiv Nadar, and Cyrus Poonawalla. Okay. So you might say, well, it's only 4 out of 100. On the other hand, India's position in terms of per capita income in the world is still relatively low. Right? India is officially a so-called lower middle income country, according to World Bank classifications. I also have some criticisms of those classifications, but putting that to one side, it's not at all obvious what's the right number of Indian billionaires in the top 100. One could argue that it should be 0 if one is an egalitarian, right? Or if one believes that the number of billionaires is a point of national pride, as some people appear to believe, then one might say, well, the more the better. But whatever one's view of that, this is the number, 4, right? And I would put it to you, though I didn't look at the Forbes data on Indian contribution to the world's billionaires in 1980, 1990, or 2000, or even 2010, it would have been less than 4, maybe even 0 in some of those earlier years. Okay. Now let's look at this problem from another point of view, which is spatial. The ratio of real per capita income of the highest per capita income states or provinces to the lowest per capita income states or provinces in 5 countries, or five countries and regions: India, Brazil, China, the European Union, and the United States. In India, the ratio is 9.89. At the bottom is Bihar. At the top is Goa, but with Delhi, Sikkim, and others being quite close to it. 9.89, almost 10, is the ratio of average incomes, per capita incomes. Brazil, 6.4. Brazil's, of course, widely considered in development economics lore to be a very unequal country, but China is more unequal. India is more unequal. I meant to say, India is more unequal from this particular standpoint, using this particular measure. China, that was on my mind, because it's the next jurisdiction I was going to mention, has a ratio of 4.48. Little less than 5. European Union, 4.7. United States, 2.04. Interestingly, the poorest state in the United States is Mississippi, and the richest, I think I included it for this purpose, though it's technically not a state, is Washington, D.C., with Massachusetts coming up quite close behind, if I remember correctly. By the way, this is just a side point, but it's quite interesting that capital cities are very rich in all of these countries, because they're showered with benefits from the public exchequer, right? So it's not a surprise that Delhi is as rich as it is from that standpoint. Brasilia in Brazil is the highest per capita income state or jurisdiction, by far, by large measure. Washington, D.C., as I just mentioned. Okay. Beijing in China is up there. Now, what about over time? Let's look at the ratio of per capita income of Maharashtra to Bihar. As I mentioned, Bihar was and is the poorest. In 1960, the ratio was 1.90. Maharashtra, by the way, is not at the very top of the Indian league table, right? But it's in the upper portion. But I use the example because we're in Maharashtra. In 1960, the ratio was 1.9. In 2021, it was 4.43. So obviously there's been a more robust growth process in Maharashtra than there has been in Bihar. Would not be a surprise to you. But it tells you that not only have the relative rankings remained constant, Bihar remains at the bottom, was at the bottom, and remains at the bottom, but there have been changes in absolute position. Now, I don't know if we have time for this or whether it's technically possible, but there's a short YouTube video I wanted to just show you a part of. If we can avoid the advertisement, I hope it won't come up.
No, we can see it.
Okay.
The YouTube video.
Just a minute. And you don't need the music. You can shut off, make it muted, please. This is a data visualization. Is it muted? Okay. So this is a data visualization of the change in relative positions of Indian states. You'll see there's not much movement. Here and there you'll see a little bit of a switch. It's all normalized so that the richest country's bar its height doesn't change over time, even though the numbers are changing, right? You'll see there's really very little shift in relative position. Occasionally you see one of these bars change position with another bar, but not much at all, which is very interesting. It tells you that whatever growth process there has been in the country has not actually led to enormous changes in relative position of these states. Okay? And indeed, as I showed you with the Maharashtra-Bihar example, it has led to some increase in the gap that exists between the states. Now, as I will go on to describe a little bit in the next slides, there might be some reason to think, economists have argued this at times, that capital should flow, for example, to the poorest countries or the poorest regions within a country, from the standpoint that that's where the marginal product of capital, if you believe in this framework, would be highest. If you take the view that the marginal product of capital is a decreasing function of the amount of capital that there is, capital per person if you like, then the marginal product of capital should be lower in Bihar than it is in Maharashtra. So you should see capital flowing to Bihar from Maharashtra, right? But it doesn't seem to be the case. If anything, I suspect we would find that the capital was flowing in the other direction, as it flows from sub-Saharan Africa to Europe, arguably, through capital flight, for instance. Right? So it's clear that the standard model is not quite telling us what is happening. Right? There's some deficiency there which we would need to address. Okay, I think we're now at the end, right? All right. Could we go back to the presentation? Thank you. Okay. Right. All right. And of course, this is not just an interstate spatial difference, but it's also an urban-rural spatial difference, as all of us know from the interocular test. So again, from the same paper, here we have the urban and the rural distributions for India in 2011-12. The urban distribution is the dashed lower line, and the rural distribution is the solid line, a little bit higher and to the left, right? So you can see that on average, the urban people are richer. And this is also represented in the fact that if you look at the two dashed lines on the right that are very close to each other, one is the 90th percentile of the rural population, the other is the 50th percentile of the urban population in India, right? And as I mentioned to you, there are various issues of mismeasurement or lack of measurement which might be involved, I think especially in the urban case, but some might argue more so in the rural case. Certainly at the top end, I think there are serious problems of measurement, but this does give you an idea of their very different relative positions, right? If you look at the consumption distribution by state and rural or urban status, as this picture does, again from the same paper, the top 5 states' urban population is the solid line at the top. The other than top 5 rural states' population is the bottom dashed line. Very, very different positions. I won't interpret these in absolute terms, but I think you can see from the left-hand side axis that they're very different absolute positions. Here's a nice passage from the same paper which talks about why there would be an incentive to migrate from Bihar to Delhi. That if you're in the 60th percentile in rural Bihar, and you relocate to the 10th percentile in Delhi, then this still increases your consumption from 12,000 to 16,000 rupees. And of course, there are various other kinds of amenities and so on which are available to people when they move to a city such as Delhi. As I noted earlier, according to standard economics, you might think that all the capital would flow to the poor places. That's what's referred to as convergence in economic theory, growth theory. And the standard diagram is the left-hand side, standard Solo type diagram, which many of you will be familiar with who studied a little macroeconomics, right? And this looks like it satisfies even, if you want to get technical, the so-called Inada condition that actually the marginal product of capital is infinite the closer you get to zero. Not only does it increase, it becomes infinite. Well, that looks like a fairy tale because of the reasons I mentioned. On the right-hand side is perhaps a more realistic diagram, which comes from a paper by Jeffrey Sachs from 2004 on sub-Saharan Africa's poverty trap, but I think it could refer to Bihar's poverty trap, potentially as well, which is that perhaps the marginal product of capital is quite low when incomes are low, and that could be for a whole range of reasons, right? So there's an S-shaped curve here rather than a purely concave curve. What are those reasons? They could be reasons to do with weak institutions. They could be reasons to do with income productivity relationships. For example, the famous health productivity relationship, which goes back to Adam Smith, but which Harvey Leibenstein discussed, and more recently, Partha Dasgupta and many others, including Jeffrey Sachs here. Sachs describes three kinds of poverty traps which might arise in this particular paper, one having to do with productivity, one having to do with savings, and one having to do with demographics. Your savings might be lower if you're poorer. You might have faster population growth if you're poorer, which is, again, widely observed feature of demography. Okay. So absolute conditions do matter a great deal. Alleviating those absolute conditions through public investments or other means, improving them, may foster and facilitate growth. And that's very crucial to do. But at the same time, I would argue that we should pursue a more demanding relativist, not relativist, I said I wouldn't use that word, relative conception of inclusivity for a few different reasons. And I'll just mention some here. I think that the absolutist conception is too easy to attain. It's not that it's not a good thing to reduce poverty, but it doesn't do enough to foster our understanding of what kinds of policies and approaches to adopt. And I think China's case is a very good example of that. Was the stark increase in inequalities within China a necessary consequence for the poverty reduction that took place in China? That's a counterfactual, which would be difficult to assess. But it's certainly one that economists and others can think about and talk about and look at very seriously. There is a likelihood of lock-in of inequalities due to the starkly unequal political economy that very sizable relative inequalities create. I think that I don't need to say more. I showed you a picture of the 4 Indian billionaires being contributed to the top 100, 2 of whom are in the top 20, if I recall. But it's not only those people at the very top end of the income spectrum, but others who shape and influence the local political economy, regional political economy, and national political economy, even the global political economy, in ways that may make other kinds of redistributive efforts more difficult. I'm not a great fan of taxation as an approach to dealing with distributional issues in the way that Professor Piketty is. You know, he has an almost relentless focus on taxation. I think that it has its role to play, but I don't think that it's the tool with which to address distributional issues. I believe much more in taking as I think suggested so far today, an ex ante rather than ex post approach to the problem, looking at how we can shape the distributional process as part and parcel of the growth process, rather than trying to step in and generate correctives. But that having been said, it's very interesting that India has abolished its wealth tax at the very moment that Professor Piketty is arguing that countries everywhere in the world should adopt one, and some countries are doing so. Why has that happened? Is it simply because it brought in too little revenue, that it was too difficult to enforce and to calculate and so on, as some have argued, or are there some political economy reasons for that? An interesting question. And of course, we should go beyond monetary concerns to accommodate how lives go, as well as to look at the process of development and not just the outcome. This will be my last slide. I apologize if I've taken a little too long. What does all of this mean for theory and for policy? Well, I think there are many different implications that it has. Obviously, here we're talking about a broad term, inclusive development. Many of you may be working in your own research and in your studies as well on rather more specialized topics. But how we think about this broad question should shape, I think, how we think about those more specific questions, which may be sectoral in nature. I think that a concern for inclusive development in the more challenging terms that I have outlined would mean placing or requiring that public investments and public policies meet a certain test. Every action should be assessed from the standpoint of harms and benefits understood in terms of inclusivity of development, for which we would need to develop and require the corresponding project and policy assessment frameworks. If you go back to the 1970s, where there was a literature on cost-benefit analysis and project evaluation, one of the elements which came up in that literature was the idea that there should be distributional weights which would be employed in doing project evaluation before a project was sanctioned or implemented. Right? And that's one way of thinking about the problem. But I think that we can go beyond that, and we should go beyond that, bringing in qualitative as well as quantitative elements and more rigorously employing in public policy these kinds of frameworks. I'll give a very small example, which is that of roads. I happen to come from, my father's ancestral village is in Andhra Pradesh, and I just visited it last week. And the nearby town, it's very interesting to go through the nearby town, little tiny town. Half of the shops have been literally broken in half. You might have seen this here and elsewhere. Because there's a national highway which is being constructed. It's being widened. The road is being widened. And what's very interesting to me is that there's been an enormous destruction of livelihoods, which I would imagine would have happened as a direct result of that, because the shopkeepers have lost their shops. They may have been squatting, but if they were squatting for decades, not just for years. And oftentimes we think that squatting for some years should confer a right, but perhaps that's not the case on government land, only on private land. At any rate, these shops have been literally bulldozed. Now, what is the benefit cost evaluation which should apply in such a case in terms of destruction of livelihoods and inclusivity or lack thereof? Presumably, there's an argument for the widening of the national highway in terms of the knock-on effects, benefits it would generate for the people in that region and beyond. This is a highway which I believe will go from Mumbai to Chennai. But there are also some immediate and obvious questions raised by the interocular test as to who is harmed as well as who is benefited. And one would like to know what kind of an evaluation was done ex ante of this particular project with respect to inclusivity, not only in environmental consequences, but also the social and economic consequences. I have generally held the view, although of course this may depend on the particulars, that rural roads are likely to have greater benefits, roads that connect small places in terms of generating economic and social inclusion, than such projects as national highways. So should one shift the balance a little bit from building national highways to building the feeder networks of roads and the more diverse networks of roads that connect other places? This would be a question. I'm not a transport economist. I'm not going to answer the question. I'm simply going to ask it. But it would be a very interesting question, certainly, to address from this standpoint, and so on and so forth. There are innumerable questions of this kind which require the framework of inclusivity in order to address them properly, which is why I end by saying it is the way of thinking that matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, sir, for making us understand how important it is to understand the difference between absolute and relative concepts of measuring the indices for development. I, in the meantime, had a real-time feedback, and students loved it because you showed the exact topics which they've studied, like Gini coefficient and all, and the macroeconomic solo model and so on, and they were quite interested in the lecture. Thank you so much, sir. To further deliberate upon this topic and to understand how to measure beyond GDP and understanding the well-being, may I please invite Dr. Seeta Prabhu ma'am to first give the closing remarks for the event and to deliberate upon it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Reddy, for bringing the rigorous analysis of poverty. And as I said right in the beginning, inequality and poverty are generally dealt with in two separate realms. Inequality and poverty are normally dealt with in two separate realms. Now, just to his credit, and I can understand the difficulties of dealing with them simultaneously. We have attempted that in our own book, and it was not easy at all. So thanks for this insightful lecture. There are still a whole lot of questions that arise. You dealt with the concept of inclusive growth, which is the one, to me, when we even say inclusive growth or inclusive development, it means that all boats have not been lifted equally. At the beginning of the post-World War development process, I would just like to reflect a bit, especially since all are students of economics, and particularly the assumptions we make and the belief system we carry with us. How is it that country after country has ended up with a growth process where inequalities seem to be cropping up as a serious issue going further? Because it can also trigger social unrest. There is unequal sharing of incomes, and the worst demonstration of it has been during the COVID-19 period, when you found that the income of the billionaires, globally increased tremendously by $3.9 billion, whereas that of labor income globally had declined by $3.7 billion. It tells you something about the wonky priorities that we have and the structural factors that might be actually influencing the growth process. There is a dictum that Simon Kuznets had proposed initially during the 60s, that as income grows, there will be an increase in inequality because workers are moving from agriculture to industry. Initially, the wages are higher, and later on, as more and more workers move to the manufacturing and industry sector, the inequality would come down. We find in country after country, the first part is true, that as incomes have grown, there is increase in within country inequality, but the decline in the income inequality has not come about easily, and many of the factors are due to the structural factors that are there, and the growth process not being increasing the employment and incomes of the lower sections of the population. Here I would also like to just add to what Professor Reddy said, that while we think of redistribution, very often we think of income and asset redistribution, which are extremely difficult processes to implement in any economy, leave alone in a democracy. But we don't appreciate the impact that education can have on redistribution. In fact, I would consider good quality secondary education as a redistributive measure, because that enhances the incomes of the current generation. It stems the transmission of poverty from one generation to other. While you are poor, which is not a desirable state, but to see the next generation also not being able to rise above the poverty line is indeed traumatic. And especially when you see that the others at the upper end of the income spectrum are having a better life chances. So the inequality in incomes, the inequality in wealth, and the inequality in opportunities. And these are some things that we have to really ponder around and take some lessons on that. Now, one other thing that has come out from the presentation is the severe lack of current data on poverty. You will find that, what we measure is what we treasure. I would say that we are not measuring things that we ought to be doing, and there's been a slowdown in the growth process as well in the data part. And I'll speak a little about it in a little later. But I would like to ask Professor Sanjay Reddy, particularly with respect to India, that India seems to be, now, and many other countries, many analysts have talked of the middle income trap, where uh, incomes grow in the middle income countries, that is the upper middle income countries, but they are not able to cross over to the higher income countries, even over a 50, 60-year period. And largely, while there are many factors, one of the important factors is the lack of capabilities, the lack of education, higher level education, secondary and above, to implement innovations and to take the economy further ahead. South Korea is one example where a systematic, good quality secondary education has actually improved the lives of people. Whereas Mexico, which had much higher incomes in the 1960s than South Korea, had to fall back because while they emphasized primary education, the secondary education component was not given equal importance. So I would like to ask you, do you think India is in a danger of falling into the lower middle income trap? I mean, we talk of the middle income trap, not all agree on the middle income trap concept, but it might be useful analytical tool to see that maybe there's just a slowdown. But there might be a capability poverty trap about which we talk quite a bit. So is there a danger that India might get stuck in the lower middle income country? This in itself is an anachronism that when we were studying, we thought as incomes increase, poverty will come down. Now, the peculiarity of the current situation is that the poor are concentrated in middle income countries. And what does that tell you? That as incomes, average incomes grow, it is not necessary that poverty will decline. In fact, India has the largest number of poor as a middle income country, lower middle income country. So, this relationship between growth and distribution is something that has to be tackled head on. And in an unequal structures, it is not possible for opportunities to be distributed equally, and the intergenerational transmission of poverty will continue, particularly when you saw in the COVID-19 period how the poor became much more vulnerable. One other statistic from the economic survey of the latest economic survey, that the MPI, multidimensional poverty index, for India was 16.4%, were multidimensionally poor, which translates to 229 million people. But more interesting is that 18.7% were vulnerable to multidimensional poverty. That is another 261 million people. And this data is from the economic survey, so it's been accepted by the government. What does that show? That any single shock to the system, to the incomes of the people, you would find that a large number would slip back into poverty. So if you would take these two, it's a substantial amount, nearing about 500 million, slightly less than that. That this is the huge burden of poverty that India has. So in this context, my second question to Professor Reddy to reflect on is that do you think these direct benefit transfer schemes or cash transfers would actually help out in terms of improving the opportunities, improving the levels of living of the poor? And if so, is it fiscally sustainable? And while these two questions, I think for now I would want you to see. And the third part, which I'll end with this, is regarding the climate change. With climate change compounding with the other factors of unequal education opportunities, there is going to be unequal sharing of the burden of climate change. As it is at the global level, you find developing countries are impacted much more than the developed countries, though much of the emissions were on account of the developed countries and their resource intensive process of growth. And if the climate change is going to affect the poor, vulnerable, especially in coastal areas, on hilly areas, on denuded and degraded lands, then the problem will become much more complicated because any transfers of income are not going to solve this. And maybe it is time to put back equity as a goal of all development policy and not look at only per capita income growth. So I would pose just these three questions, and thank you.
So I was just saying that Professor Prabhu, as usual, asked a lot of quite searching questions, and there's so much in them that I can't easily do justice to them. But let me try to say something briefly about each. First of all, I think that she's absolutely right that one has to pay central attention to education and other tools of mobility. And as Amartya Sen and others have pointed out, this is a very serious failure in India, and it remains one, especially when one looks at the quality of education and not just the quantity of education, and to what extent people are being prepared to participate in national and global labor market in ways that are remunerative. I mentioned this morning to the director that there's a line attributed to Joan Robinson, the economist, that for everything that's true about India, its opposite is also true. And this is clearly the case with human resources, that this is a country that has immense human resources. It can do incredibly sophisticated things technologically. But it also has an enormous number of people who not just lag behind, but lack the most basic level of capability to participate in a modern market economy. So one would need centrally to address that, and I think that would be part of an ex-ante approach, as I put it, looking at what kinds of investments one would need to make to equip people to participate remuneratively and effectively in a democratized market economy, bringing the market to them, bringing them to the market, and ensuring that the market is of a kind that can enable them to be successful participants as well, through, for example, certain regulatory and other measures. I am not against the market, quite the opposite, but I would like to have that market have qualitative features, because every market is to some extent structured by state efforts and activity that would facilitate this kind of remunerative engagement on the part of people. But for that, people also need to be equipped. So there's more than one side to the problem. My former colleague, recently deceased, Professor Lance Taylor, wrote a famous article with a Brazilian co-author in which he referred to the concept of Bel India, a Belgium within India. Right? Now, at that time when he wrote the article, the sophisticated, technologically sophisticated and wealthy sector in India was comparable perhaps to Belgium. Now maybe it's a Germany within India or something else of that nature. But nevertheless, there is not just a periphery, there is a vast under or unincluded segment which would need to be attended to from these standpoints. And it's not just a question of welfare, it is a question of mobility, and it is a question of equipment to participate. Now, the question was raised about cash transfers. Cash transfers have been very popular in recent times. I am not a fan of them as the solution to everything. And I think that one reason was implicit in the early remark I made, that mainstream economics is by and large engaged in a fantasy view of the relationship between growth and distribution. Growth first, distribution second. Indeed, in the national election in India that took place in 2014, there was a suggestion that growth first was one of the platforms of one of the parties, current ruling party, and that was also echoed by some of the economists who spoke out at that time, as if growth and distribution were somehow opposites. But in my view, they're not opposites. They're part and parcel of the same process. So what kind of a growth process do you want? Do you want one which is distributionally inclusive, or do you want one that isn't? That's the question. It's not a question of whether you're for or against growth. That's nonsensical. But what kind of a growth process do you want? And if you want a growth process which is inclusive, then you have to do certain things to facilitate that. But cash transfers, which emerge from this fantasy view that you can ex post generate resources adequate to enable people to live well, do not have a sustainable political economy, because there will always be some antagonism toward them from those who are being taxed in order to pay for transfers. Unlike wage incomes, which people are being paid as a result of being productive participants in the market economy, a democratized market economy. And there are other problems as well. So it's not that there aren't arguments for cash transfers, but I think that the notion that this is the solution is, in my view at least, erroneous. I would also note that tellingly, the level of cash transfers is never spoken about, because one of the things that is possible when you have substituted all the existing programs, in-kind programs, with cash transfers, which is one of the intentions of those who propound cash transfers, as if they are on the view that they're more efficient. One of the things that becomes possible is to whittle them down in a way that it's not possible when you are being provided a subsidy for a gas canister or whatever it happens to be. So I think that that feature of non-transparency and lack of anchoring in any kind of real contribution to well-being is problematic. Finally, on the last issue of climate change, I would say that again, hello, you can hear me? So on the issue of climate change, I would view this as being really a problem to be addressed using the same framework, that one has to be thinking ex ante about what one is doing to the ecosystem, what one is doing to the social and economic systems as a result of the kind of growth and development one has, which has dynamic implications. It has consequences in the next round or rounds, right? So for example, if one is facilitating, encouraging climate change, deforestation, overfishing, or whatever it is, these activities have consequences in the next, for the next generation, but even for this generation in due course. So one would need to think about that as a livelihood problem, as an inclusive growth and development problem, and not just as an ecological problem. And I think that that's been a source of narrowness that's been quite unfortunate in terms of its implications.
Since we have another function to move on, and Sir has to take a flight and we are beyond time, complex issues don't have straightforward solutions. So you may talk about poverty and link it with inequalities, and we look at the Goa and the Bihar and the Maharashtra, thing, and you look at the millionaires and billionaires, millionaires who are leaving the country. Taxes are not happening, and because it's not economical. Lots to ponder about, lots to debate about. So we take it from here, and Niharika, we go to the next part of the program to save further time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am. That was a wonderful and very insightful discussion. Thank you, ma'am and sir, for deliberating upon the topic. Proceeding further with the event, we also know that today coincides the date when we announced the 6th edition of Economist of the Year. Economist of the Year is the flagship event of SSE. It is the brainchild of Dr. Chandiramani. It is a meticulously crafted competition with diverse array of events. EOTY started in 2017, and it is an educational event tapping into every contestant's intellectual and enthusiastic side. It shall test the skills required in our dynamic world and reveal the economist hiding in all the students. EOTY has helped bring forward some great budding economists. It's a competition that would challenge the students to use their attributes like critical thinking, analytical abilities, and general economic knowledge along with research skills. This year's theme for Economist of the Year is Dystopia, the Perfect Utopia. With this, I now please request the chair of the session, Dr. Seeta Prabhu ma'am, to please announce the official opening of EOTY 6th edition.
Delighted to know that there are awards for students at such a young age. It just shows the vision and the way in which the students are being shaped to think beyond what is taught in the class and to apply this. I would also thank Professor Chandramani for asking me to inaugurate this. I think we were to discuss a bit on going beyond GDP, and due to shortage of time, I think we will truncate that, and maybe there'll be an occasion later on where we can discuss issues beyond the GDP, because I think GDP is now being junked by most economies as a measure of human progress. And for those who would like to know more about it, in our book on human development in an unequal world, there is a full chapter, and that's what I was going to discuss. So now it is not required. This book must be in your library already. So please look up the chapter on measuring human progress. I think it's chapter 5. And most of the issues regarding the inadequacy of GDP and the way in which there are missing indicators and even empty indicators is being discussed there. What is an empty indicator? Indicator does not indicate the phenomenon that it is supposed to measure. Enrollment rates, for example, is supposed to be a measure of education, attainment. But then there is enrollment and no learning at the school levels. Then the indicator, when you use enrollment as indicator in indices, it really does not convey the meaning. So many of these issues have been discussed here, and I do hope that you will have an opportunity to deliberate on these issues at a later date. And with this few words, I would like to declare the Economist of the Year event open. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, ma'am. To quickly give an overview of Economist of the Year and its round, I now invite head of the EOTY Club for this year, Ms. Paridhi.
A very good afternoon to one and all present here. It is my utmost honor and pleasure to welcome you all to the 6th edition of the Economist of the Year 2023. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to serve as the head for the academic year 2023. In line with U20 and Y20 goals, this year the competition aspires to be extremely youth-driven, where the participants will have to think critically in policy making, requiring the ability to apply economic concepts in real life, and most importantly, deal with chaos with a clear mind. The competition has 3 rounds, the first round being Adunas Fortuna Irvat, which means fortune favors the bold. The initial round will test the skills of strategy and decision-making, level-headedness, and in topics ranging from law to STEM, with sprinkles of real-world application of G20 nations all over. The second round, Sic Parvis Magna, or greatness comes from humble beginnings. The top 50 participants will move closer to the title. Here onwards, they shall be given a prompt about G20 nations, its well-beings and assets, and how they perform on the real-world stage. Like Dr. Reddy mentioned, here the participants will be judged on their ability to not only grow, but grow inclusively. The last round is the panel discussion. To inculcate the culture of research at SSE, the third and final round tests the importance of knowledge in the real world. Our esteemed panel would critique the presentations based on research and their presentation of the final 5. Since EOTY has always been an academic event, this year we thought of adding fun to it. With that, for the first time ever, EOTY presents the first edition of its pre-event, Detente, A Bridge of Spies, where we bring to you games and experiences based on economic theories such as Nash equilibrium. I would like to extend my gratitude towards our guest, Dr. Sanjay Reddy and Dr. Seeta Prabhu. Your presence has really set the tone for the event. We thank VC ma'am for her unwavering support in all student-led activities across Symbiosis University. I'm deeply grateful to our director, Dr. Jyoti, and deputy director, Dr. Sudeepa Majumdar, and our faculty in charges, Dr. Niharika Singh and Dr. Gargi Patel, and the entire faculty who've been a constant pillar of support and guidance throughout this journey. EOTY would not have been the way it is if not for the extraordinary team behind it, who have worked day and night to ensure that this event is a memorable one for all. Finally, our sponsors have played an instrumental role in making this event possible. The 6th edition of the Economist of the Year has been brought to you by SSE in collaboration with MBA Center in association with Karor Vyasa Bank, powered by Unstop, co-powered by IMS, FinLatix, Blend Booth, Bubbles and Butterflies, Twisties, Mighty Crust, Burgertron, and blog partners ED Times and Campus Times. Thank you so much for one and all present here. Looking forward to your participation in both our pre-event and the Economist of the Year. Let's see if the title is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paridhi. Looking forward to all your participation in our 6th edition of EOTY. Now I invite our Deputy Director, Dr. Sudeepa Majumdar, to deliver the vote of thanks, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are indeed privileged and grateful to have such stalwarts with us today, commemorating the 9th Professor Suresh Tendulkar Memorial Lecture. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the family of late Professor Suresh Tendulkar for giving us this platform and this honor to conduct the series of lectures year after year at SSE. On behalf of the Symbiosis School of Economics, let me extend our heartiest thanks to Professor Sanjay Reddy and Professor Seeta Prabhu for being with us today. We have been truly enlightened. When we look at the larger picture, India's growth story has been quite impressive. We have been witnessing improvements in life expectancy, in child mortality, in literacy. However, when one looks deeper, as we witnessed just now, the trends have been very disturbing in terms of persistence of poverty and inequality. Our recently concluded international conference on the future of employment, challenges and opportunities, FICO 2023, brought out some of the growing concerns about the quantity as well as the quality of the employment opportunities in India in terms of jobless growth, in terms of the challenges in the informal sector, gender discrimination, educated, unemployed youth. So there is a widening inequality in every socioeconomic sphere. Moreover, India is also trying to cope with the challenge of the 4th industrial revolution of automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, and thus making inclusivity even more elusive. Goal 1 of the SDG 2030 agenda reads, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. And I read that Professor Reddy says that this surely does not mean end whatever we choose to call poverty by taking any convenient measure. Thank you, sir, for an enthralling and very insightful talk today. As has been already discussed with the G20 focus on SDGs, nations are gradually encapsulating societal values as the key variables rather than GDP, looking into well-being rather than growth rates, looking into quality of life, sustainability issues rather than monetary values of production. Taking on from these G20 initiatives, our 6th edition of the Economist of the Year is all geared up for the stream of upcoming events over the next few weeks. Our special thanks to Professor Seeta Prabhu for being amongst us today to grace the occasion for the official opening of EOTY 2023. Thank you, ma'am. Our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Rajni Gupte ma'am, has been a constant source of support, motivation, and encouragement in all our endeavors. Thank you, ma'am, for inspiring us and motivating us once again and gracing the event today. This event, the Suresh Tendulkar Memorial Lecture, is also the brainchild of our director, Professor Jyoti Chandraramani. It is her dynamism, enthusiasm, passion, her never-ending energy which drives this institution. We are indeed grateful to you, ma'am, to have got Professor Sanjay Reddy and Professor Seeta Prabhu amongst us today. Thanks a lot for everything that you do. Thanks to our wonderful students, thanks to all my colleagues, our staff, all of you present here today, all of you who've joined us online. Special thanks to our IT team, our creative team, our logistics team, our student volunteers, the council members, and of course, this was a wonderful platform to inaugurate another flagship event of SSE, the Economist of the Year. Thank you, everyone.